Hello, welcome to episode 2 of the Truth and Discovery podcast. Today I'm thrilled to welcome Russ Breault onto the show. Russ has devoted many decades to sharing information and ultimately the message of the Shroud of Turin with the entire world. For those not already aware what the Shroud of Turin is and why it's significant, I'm going to allow Russ to share that momentarily. Ultimately, I chose to do an episode on the subject because it's fascinated me ever since I was a child. Literally back when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I saw a video documentary on it that my parents had rented from our church library. I maybe didn't understand it very well at the moment, but I could tell that it was something that was both mysterious and important, and ultimately caused me to want to learn more. I actually had the privilege of talking at length with Russ about the Shroud of Turin about 10 years ago. At that time, I was planning to write a book on the subject, but between the busyness of both my career and family life, I've instead transitioned to sharing amazing stories, such as the Shroud of Turin via podcast. So I'm very much looking forward to allowing Russ to share his wealth of knowledge with all of you here today. Russ, thank you for coming on to the show today.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Russ, can you please share with our listeners about your career, professional background, and what seems like your lifelong mission to share with the world about the Shroud of Turin?
Well, that's true. It is certainly lifelong. I got involved in it back in college. And I'm dating myself now, all the way back to 1980. I was a writer for the college newspaper, and the news of the Shroud was very big at that time because in 1978, you had a whole team of 33 American scientists go to Turin, Italy, to analyze a religious artifact that purported to be the burial shroud that wrapped Jesus when he was in the tomb. And of course, you don't get 33 American scientists to go to a foreign country to study a religious artifact without making a lot of news. So there were newspaper articles coming out about it all the time. Nat Geo did a big spread on it in June of 1980. So I asked if I could write some articles for the newspaper, for the college paper, and they gave me the green light to do it. And so in the fall of 1980, a two-part article series appeared, and I had all kinds of quotes from the scientists, and I'd called several of them, so I was just hooked. I said, man, this is one seriously cool mystery, and nobody knows anything about it. And so it just kind of took on a life of its own after that.
All right. Thanks for sharing that. The exciting thing, too, it sounds like just the rate of discovery or conversation has just continued to grow almost exponentially since that time. So we're trying to pack in a lot. I mean, we could probably talk about any one aspect of the Shroud, its discovery, everything else, and take hours. So, we're trying to cover a lot of ground. So, it seems to me that many people know what the Shroud of Turin is, and perhaps, nearly as many are aware that in addition to quite possibly being the actual burial shroud of Jesus, it is embroiled in debate as to whether or not it is authentic. While we want to focus on this podcast and some of the latest findings and debate, which of course are many, could you at least start us off by sharing with listeners who may be completely new to the topic, just a brief history of what the Shroud is, how it was discovered, or rather rediscovered, and what the status of the Shroud is today?
Well, first of all, what is it? A shroud, meaning a burial cloth that has wrapped a corpse. They've used burial shrouds for thousands of years across all cultures. And in Turin, Italy, which is why it's called the Shroud of Turin, because that's where it's been ever since 1578, is a long linen cloth. It's 14 feet long, yet is only 3.5 feet wide. So it is. So on this cloth is a faint image of about a 5'10", possibly as tall as 6 feet, man, front and back image that is so this cloth obviously enveloped him lengthwise, and it is covered with blood stains that correlate with the wounds of crucifixion, but not just any crucifixion, specifically the crucifixion of Jesus, because, you have the very evident over 30 puncture wounds around the head for an apparent crown of thorns. Well, that's the singular, feature about the crucifixion of Jesus, because that was a mockery as someone who claimed to be king of the Jews. Then the second feature you see is that there's scourge marks or whip marks all over the body. I mean, well over 120 scourge marks to be counted from the base of the neck all the way down to the ankles. It's not just on the back, it's on the front chest and thighs as well. And so this man was brutalized. And so now Pontius Pilate ordered him to be flogged. Why did Pontius Pilate, flog him so badly? Is because he didn't think Jesus was guilty of a crime worthy of capital punishment. And the first thing he did was that he sent him to King Herod. Herod sent him back. Then he tried to trade Barabbas. That didn't work. And so finally he has him scourged to within an inch of his life, thinking that when this bloodied hulk of a man came walking back into the courtyard, that maybe they'd say, okay, that's enough. You don't have to kill him. But that's not what happened. And so in spite of being brutally scourged, he was still crucified. And so that's another anomaly, because you see, most people were either scourged and released as a form of punishment, or they were crucified for execution. Rarely would they be scourged so brutally and crucified, because the Romans, they were a brutal bunch, and they wanted you to stay alive on the cross as long as possible while you're dying. Imagine that. And so then we have the fact that the legs are not broken. How is that? What does that mean? Well, Jesus was crucified about 9 a.m. About 3 p.m, Jesus gave up his spirit, so he was hanging on the cross for about 6 hours. Sometime after that, the Roman soldiers came back by, probably around 3:30 or 4, to remove the bodies from the crosses. And it says, and they came to the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and he was still alive. And so they broke his legs. They had this large wooden mallet weighing about 15 pounds, and we just break the legs under the knees, shatter the bones. And then they came to the next thief also. He was still alive. They broke his legs. But when they came to Jesus, they noticed he was already dead. So they did not break his legs, but instead they stabbed him in the side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Probably not water, probably the separation of blood and blood serum, which would be indicative of a post-mortem blood wound. In other words, a blood flow that occurred after death, when the blood is no longer circulating. So the question is, why would they break the legs of the two thieves anyways? Because it would speed the process of asphyxia, which is the inability to breathe. And then they would basically die within 10 minutes of just suffocating, because you have to be able, if you just hang from your wrists by 2 nails without any other support, you're going to be dead pretty quick. And it's so they had to provide a way for these victims to stand up and down on this cross. And so they would oftentimes put a little wooden wedge up there, allowing them to release the pressure from their chest to kind of stand up and then back down again, just constant motion so that they could breathe. And then, but obviously if you break the legs, they're not going to be able to breathe. And so all this is on the shroud. So in other words, so you have a crown of thorns, brutally scourged, legs not broken, wound in the side. So there's no other, there's no other person in history that has received this specific set of wounds. Let me just address this question. And it's because this whole team of scientists went over to Turin. It's very important to understand that the Shroud of Turin is the most analyzed artifact in the world. There's nothing that has received as much scrutiny as the Shroud. In fact, pursuant to the Shroud Project in 1978, from 1979 to 1984, over 24 different peer-reviewed journal articles were published. And so this is top-flight science. And they went over there to answer 2 questions. What is the nature of the image, and what is the nature of the bloodstains? And they came back after 3 years of analyzing the data. They publicized this in 1981, that the Shroud is not the work of an artist, and the blood is blood. And so, in other words, you have this image on the cloth. Is it the work of, is there paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, stain? What accounts for this image? And it's not the result of an artistic process. You have a whole pattern of blood stains. Is it just paint? Is it animal blood? Is it human blood? Is it blood from actual wounds? Yeah, exactly. It's the exudate of actual wounds. And so now the plot certainly thickens. So the verdict that was rendered in 1981 by this whole team of scientists was that there was nothing about the shroud that would preclude it from being the authentic burial shroud of Jesus. And you see, because this brings us to this either or proposition with the shroud, in that it either is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus or it's not. And if it's not, well, then what is it? If it's not authentic, then it must be the work of human effort somehow, some way, but it's not. And so now we're here with this perennial mystery. I published a book last year called Shroud Encounter, Explore the World's Greatest Unsolved Mystery. And it's true. It remains unsolved because, we can speculate on the cause of the image, but we don't know for sure. And so that makes it kind of cool.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you for just giving the broad context. I mean, I have all sorts of questions. And in fact, just friends and family asked a lot of them, what questions do you have? What do you want to know? And some include, the history of the shroud before, the 13th and 14th century. And I remember from our conversation before, there absolutely is a track record, and things that I would encourage listeners, one, to get your book, also just to find other sources, because there is a lot else out there than maybe quote unquote mainstream media publishing has put out there. But kind of getting back to some of the other I guess more controversial or quote unquote unsolved questions you mentioned, of course, just the finding of the STIRP project in the late 70s and stretching the 80s, and then of course the infamous carbon dating test in 1988, which suggested that it's a medieval forgery, that it dates to, and I apologize, I don't remember the date right off, the 13th to 14th century. But if you could talk just briefly about of course what the study found, but why that may actually be somewhat problematic in terms of accepting that as a decisive conclusion.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you have two bodies of scientific data. You have everything that was amassed in 1978. You have to understand that they went over there with 70 crates of gear weighing over 10 tons, brought from various laboratories throughout the United States. And they did spectroscopy, X-radiography, infrared thermography, photomicroscopy, and they collected a lot of data. And if there was any evidence of the shroud being the work of an artist, it would have been found. And so the conclusion there was rendered in 1981. 7 years later, it was carbon dated by three different carbon dating labs. And they say, hold on, boys, not so fast. It has a date range of 1260 to 1390, must be the work of an artist. And from the 14th century, we're done here. This is over. Mystery solved. Well, actually, they didn't solve anything. All they did was compound the mystery, is because those of us who are knowledgeable of the shroud know that there's no one in the 14th century who is capable of producing the shroud. There's a chapter in my book called "The Challenge of Art History," and we look at some of the artists that modern skeptics have posed a few possibilities of various 14th century artists who conceivably could have created the shroud. So we've looked at all of the work of these artists. One was Simone Martini, who died in, I think, maybe 1340. Another one was Nato Ceccarelli, another Italian artist who died in like maybe 1360 or so. Anyway, so these were the candidates that were suggested. So we looked at all the work of these artists, and there's nothing that they've done that in any way remotely compares to what we see on the Shroud, either artistically or stylistically, or even the use of substances, or nothing. And so then to allege then that this is the work of a 14th century forger, is rather problematic, because no one has been named, no particular artist has been suggested, no particular technique or process has been posed. So it's just this glib dismissal of the Shroud, based on this one test. Now let's look a little closer at this test. Because in 1988, they were supposed to cut 3 different samples from 3 different locations on the Shroud. They didn't do that. They cut 1 sample from the outside corner edge, exactly where it had been held and handled hundreds of times over the centuries. I mean, literally, I'm talking about when they displayed the Shroud. May 4th was the official feast day of the Holy Shroud. They would bring it out every year on that day for public viewing and veneration, and they would build this platform, and you have all these clerics standing up on the platform, literally holding the Shroud horizontally across this platform. So it wasn't framed, it wasn't encased, it was literally held by hand. And they did this over 275 times. And so isn't it interesting that the section that they chose to cut for carbon dating was right from that outside top corner, exactly where it had been held hundreds of times? Geez, what could go wrong? And so now they have this one sample that they cut into 3 sections. They were supposed to cut 3 different samples, but they cut 1 sample into 3 sections. Well, it's not the same. A 5th grader knows that. So now we have a problem with the veracity of this sample, because you have chemist Ray Rogers. He looks at threads from that same corner and finds that there's cotton mixed in with the flax. Well, there's no cotton anywhere else on the Shroud, but there appears to be cotton in that corner. There's a madder root dye, MADDER, madder root dye in that corner. There's no dye anywhere else on the Shroud, and so in other words, it appears that we have all the ingredients for some kind of a medieval repair or some kind of a reweave or something in that corner, which is not surprising given all the times it's been held and handled. And so now we don't even know what we dated, because they violated the sampling protocol. We don't have any other place on the cloth that was cut that can be compared with that 1 sample from the top left corner. So now we know. Now there's this latest dating technology called wide-angle X-ray scattering, and so what this does, it measures the amount of natural aging found in fibers, in various fibers. It could be wool, flax, linen, whatever. And by analyzing the amount of natural aging found in fibers from the Shroud, they determined that there's far more aging evident in fibers from the Shroud for it to be only 700 years old, as the carbon dating lab said. In fact, the amount of aging found in fibers from the Shroud corresponds with a linen sample found at Masada, right there in Israel, circa 1st century. And so now it's like, well, who's right and who's wrong? And so clearly there is a problem with the carbon date. And it's in this interview, we don't have time to go through the whole historical trail, but I will tell you this, that there's no question that the Shroud was in Constantinople in 1204, and stolen during the Fourth Crusade, stolen by the French, which is why 150 years later it shows up in Lirey, France, property of Geoffrey de Charnay, the most valorous knight of the realm. And it's curious that it goes underground for a while because the sack of Constantinople was never supposed to happen. It was never authorized by the Pope Innocent III, and so therefore, when these Crusaders got into the city in 1204, they stole everything blind. They just robbed the city of all the silver, gold, ivory, relics of the saints, and everything was ripped off and brought back to the West. And the Pope, who was trying to reconcile with the Eastern Church, hoping to bring them back together again. Well, that was never going to happen after the Fourth Crusade. And so he puts an edict of excommunication on anyone who stole relics and did not return them. Well, what's the chance of that ever happening? There's never, none of it gets returned. And so that's why the Shroud goes underground for about 150 years and then pops up 1356 and is owned, like I say, by is in the possession of Geoffrey de Charnay. And now, so we know for a fact that the Shroud was in Constantinople in 1204, stolen during the Fourth Crusade. And so 1204 is already older than the oldest carbon date of 1260. So, and this cloth that was in Constantinople didn't just get there. It had been there since 944 when it was brought there from Edessa. And so clearly the carbon date is wrong. And it's now, is it first century? I don't know. I certainly think it is. But then again, I mean, wide angle X-ray scattering seems to put it right at first century. But dating is probably always going to be, I don't know that the church will ever authorize another carbon date. So we just, I think the Shroud is probably just right where it needs to be, which is this proverbial unsolved mystery. If we conclusively dated it to the first century, then we'd have everyone running around with T-shirts saying, I told you so. And it's, and we don't want that either. So being a mystery is just fine.
Sure. No, I agree with that. Something I've wondered, you mentioned, I mean, right, they took the sample from probably one of the worst spots, just between people handling it. I know there were fires, you mentioned the linen. And I wasn't even aware that, they were supposed to take it from 3 separate spots. But who was in charge of deciding that? And, was there anyone who said, hey, wait a minute, this may not be the best way to do it? Or was there kind of a third party that was just acting on its own authority and did how they were going to go about that?
Yeah, the decision on where to cut the sand. This is really embarrassing for the Catholic Church. And in other words, the protocol was established in 1986, and of what they were going to do. But in 1988, when everyone got in that room and the Shroud was laid out on a table for about 12 hours, and it's and you have these people looking at it and doing this or that, and when it was decided finally as to where they would cut it and how many samples would be cut, that decision was made by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which is a branch of the Catholic Church. So it was the church itself that determined where the sample would be cut and how many samples would be cut. And it was an egregious type of a decision. It was based purely on aesthetics. They wanted to take it from the outside corner where it had been previously cut for textile analysis back in 1973. And so they just did it because that's where it would look nice. And but which is an astonishingly stupid thing to do, because you had the most significant carbon dating event of the 20th century is now hanging on one questionable sample from the ostensibly the worst possible sample location that you could take it from. And as I said before, what could go wrong? And it's that's how the whole thing went down. I mean, unfortunately. And then there's even more, intrigue and controversy, because when they everything that they did with the cutting of the samples was put on videotape so that you could document everything. But then when they took the samples and we're going to put them into these I guess stainless steel containers to send them off to the carbon labs, they went into another room away from the cameras to do that. Oh, that was brilliant. And so now, for anyone who wanted to suggest that there was a sleight of hand, a switching of the samples, that gives you all the ammunition you need. Why did they take it into another room, out of the view of the cameras, to actually put those samples into the steel containers? I mean, it's like someone was not thinking. And I'm not suggesting that there was sleight of hand, but for anyone who wants to make that accusation, you certainly have a valid reason to do so.
That's both very fascinating and very frustrating. So I appreciate you shedding some light on that. I'd always wondered that. And, there's another, again, we could do a whole episode on this, but, curious if you've looked at the association between the Shroud and the Sudarium of Oviedo, which just briefly was purported to be the cloth that was put on the face of Christ as he was taken down from the cross. Is it true that there are associations of the blood flow patterns, et cetera, between the two? Also, it's interesting to note that was also carbon dated, showed a date of 700 AD, but it has a documented history of at least back to 570 AD, which I think kind of proves your point that, yes, carbon dating has its place and everything else, but it's only as good as the variables and the control that goes into when it's made. But anyhow, I don't mean to answer my own question here, but if you could share just briefly on the association between the two and why that's significant.
Sure. Well, in John's gospel, it mentions that there was the linen cloth and the napkin that was about his head, that was rolled up in a place by itself. Now, this napkin, it does not mean it was a dinner napkin. It just means it's a small cloth. In fact, it's the Sudarium of Oviedo, which we think is that napkin, measures about 20 by 30 inches. So it's about the size of a small bath towel. And so this cloth ostensibly was wrapped around the face of Jesus after he died, after he gave up his spirit, but before they had removed him from the cross. So if you can imagine Jesus hanging up there on the cross and head, drooping down, and just blood all coming down from the crown of thorns all down his face, and pleural fluid coming out of his mouth and nose. It was a horrific sight, and no doubt one of the women went up to the centurion and said, "May we cover his face?" And he would have said, "Yeah, go ahead and be quick about it." And so they put a little stool up to where the cross is, and step up there and then take this cloth and wrap it around his face and pin it in the back. And it would have been a tradition to cover the face of the dead. And so this cloth remains on his face until he is removed, and they've taken him to the tomb, which was not that far away, and then he would have been laid on the. Now remember, the shroud itself is 14 feet long, so if you can imagine, he was laid on the lower portion of the cloth, and then the upper portion wrapped over him lengthwise. But the sudarium would have been removed from his face, rolled up and placed next to the body, because it had blood on it. Anything with blood had to remain with the body. So this face cloth, as it's called, would not have remained on his face. People do get confused over that because they would say, well, how do you have a face image on the shroud if this other cloth was also over his face? It wasn't. It was initially just from the transport from the cross to the tomb. But after that, it was removed and rolled up next to the body. Now, there is a correlation. It's interesting, there's no image on the sudarium, but there is a pattern it's determined to be about 6 parts pleural fluid and 1 part blood is what we see on the shroud. And this pleural effusion is when through the process of crucifixion, the lungs eventually get filled up with this pleural effusion, which is what ultimately causes death, the inability to breathe. And so that's what we see on this sudarium is just this pattern of pleural effusion. It came out, it dried, comes out. It's not every time they move the body, there's a more of this stuff that comes out. And so that's what we see. It's disgusting, really. There would be no reason to keep this cloth unless you knew that it was associated with the crucifixion of Jesus. It would be discarded immediately. And it's because it is just a mess. It's like a cloth you would use to change the oil in your car. I mean, it's just a mess. And but it does correlate. The bloodstains do correlate with the bloodstain patterns we see on the shroud. And I think the most compelling piece of data for me, which clearly associates it with the crucifixion of Jesus, is that all this pleural effusion it means that this cloth was involved in a crucifixion. And so, what other crucifixion was there that whereby you would keep this cloth? I mean, there's only one, and that's Jesus. Everyone else who was crucified were all criminals. Anyways, I think there's a high correlation. Is it definitive? Not yet. Maybe if we could ever, there's some more testing that needs to be done, but there is a high correlation.
I appreciate you shedding more light on that. I kind of had some questions in mind to ask you, and one of them I was going to ask you, when it boils down, do you believe that the shroud can ever be scientifically proven to be the burial cloth of Christ himself? And I think you've answered that a little bit. I mean, maybe we missed an opportunity, maybe we won't get one, but even then, it seems that when we look at something to be quote unquote proven scientifically, the standards can be, for better for worse, almost prohibitive. That even associations, you look at nowadays, you look at rising cancer and disease rates, and you look at all these different chemicals and everything else that are thrown into the bunch, and then you read, but we're not positive there's a correlation. I mean, it seems
right.
Well, you would have to have something wrong with your mind not to see, well, of course there's a correlation. So maybe stepping back scientifically for a moment, if we were to change the question or approach, to ask, do you think it can ever be definitively proven to be authentic from the standpoint of circumstantial case study, much like a court of law decides whether or not someone is innocent or guilty of a crime based on circumstantial evidence to the point of being deemed authentic beyond a, quote, reasonable doubt? If so, will the scientific community, could they accept that? And the same question about also the church, which, as you pointed out, has not declared an official position on the shroud.
Yeah, I would say that the answer is no. Science is never going to say that this, I don't care what they find. Even if they carbon date it again, that's first century, they're never going to definitively say this is the burial shroud of Jesus. What the STURP team found in 78, and when they published their results in 81, basically what they said is that there's nothing to say that this could not be the burial shroud of Jesus. And that's as far as science is going to take you, because it's clearly not the work of an artist. and the blood is blood, and the blood appears to be the from actual wounds. And, and so forensically, as we kind of went through earlier with the crown of thorns, wound in the side, scourging all over the body, when you try to identify the man that way, then yeah, a reasonable person would say that it appears to be authentic, and it probably is the bro shot of Jesus. But then, but don't expect science to be reasonable, is because, you still have people out there with PhDs that want to believe that our DNA got packed with 3.3 billion lines of genetic code all by random chance. And so, so don't expect science to be all that objective. And it's, science itself is driven by preconceived notions and opinions.
Yeah, it's you hate to see what appears to be a divide. I mean, obviously we don't dismiss science. I mean, science is the study of God's creation, but unfortunately the approaches are problematic, and it seems that people drive a wedge between science and faith. Why do you think that is? I mean, there's obviously many areas of science that are controversial, debatable, but when it comes to a relic such as the Shroud, it seems that there's definitely a heavy bias toward it being something that is a forgery, and that even as these new studies come out, you talked about this the X-ray study that was conducted last year. Everyone just keeps tapping the sign of, no, you got to look at the 1988 carbon date test, and it just doesn't seem that there's a lot of folks in the scientific community who are even saying, hey, hang on a minute, maybe we should take another look at this.
Well, you have a lot of people in the scientific community that certainly don't want to get involved because they know that it's not going to enhance their career. I mean, it's like, you can just imagine if some professor at some college in physics or chemistry or biology or whatever the field is suddenly expresses an interest in the Shroud. The first thing his colleagues are going to say is, "What are you doing? Why are you even pursuing this?" So there's going to be a massive amount of ridicule to start with, and peer pressure is effective. So there's only a few scientists that are going to be willing to tread that path. That because, as I said, people's worldviews are at stake here. And it's and if you have a materialist worldview, and that's well, then you're essentially saying that that anything in the realm of the supernatural cannot be considered, which is ludicrous, unfortunately, but that's the way science is. And it's like I say, you have this science hangs on to the notion that we're here, the Richard Dawkins of the world, the rabid atheist who wants everyone to believe that we got here by several trillion perfectly timed accidents of chance. And therefore it is somehow unreasonable to consider a divine origin. Well, that's just ridiculous. I mean, you and I intuitively know that when you see a chair, we know that there's any number. I don't care how many explosions there are in a lumber yard. It's never going to come up with a chair randomly. It's just not going to happen. But then again, if your worldview precludes you from considering a divine origin, well, then you're stuck with promoting a view that everyone knows is intellectually ridiculous, but you have to hang with that because you're not allowed to consider anything else. That's where science is when we're talking about things like the Shroud, which goes into if the Shroud is real, then that means Jesus is real, and that means the resurrection is real, and those are things that they just don't want to even think about. And then of course we've touched on origins. I mean, God is the creator, so there's just areas of science that will just not allow them to take it where the evidence leads. They just won't allow it.
I appreciate your perspective on that. And I very much agree, whether it's science or just everyday conversation with folks, it seems right that there's just, especially in our modern world, belief in something larger than ourselves, something that might even force us to contemplate, say, living to a certain standard, being more mindful of our mortality, whatever it is. It just seems like we're conditioned in our society these days to look away, to just be distracted. And so, the Shroud doesn't seem much different, in my opinion, from why we would want to ignore this scientifically. But, going back to kind of the idea for those, of course, who are interested to say, all right, there's probably not going to be a scientifically published article that's going to come out and say, yep, this is the burial shroud of Christ himself, and this is what it means. But to those who say, I see a lot there, and I want to know more about it, and ultimately form my own conclusion based on the evidence, some other things. Well, another question I have that, kind of ties into the scientific analysis. Someone recently did a study. They have issues with the blood flow patterns. To say, if you wrapped a corpse in linen, the blood would not flow in this direction, so on and so forth. It's fair enough to make the observation. I don't know enough to counter that, but it seems that another aspect or hypothesis of how the image of the shroud is formed, and I may be mispronouncing this, is that the Maillard reaction, essentially a intense burst of light and or heat, essentially imprinted the image into the shroud. Scientifically, is there a possibility that, let's just say if it was the Maillard reaction, something like that, would the image show different than if it was just merely from blood flow?
Let me just separate a couple of things. The Maillard reaction is simply a suggested reaction between ammonia gases releasing from the body, interacting with an alleged carbohydrate layer that was on the cloth, that was got on there when the shroud was soaked early on in the early centuries in a soapweed type of a detergent, and so in the soaking of the cloth would have left this carbohydrate residual on the or residue on all of the linen, all the fibers and threads, and it's which I'm not sure that that's even been proven that exists on the shroud, this carbohydrate layer, but it's just one of the proposals. And so this Maillard reaction is really a naturalistic explanation for the shroud image. And we've looked at examples of Maillard reaction. The one that's used is like when you put a loaf of a slice of bread in a toaster and lightly toast it. That's a Maillard reaction. So I would say I don't give a lot of credence in that, is because the shroud image is extremely uniform throughout the entire body, front to back. I mean, top to bottom, front to back. It's almost identical in image intensity wherever you look. And it penetrates the cloth only 1 to 2 microfibers, not threads, microfibers. Each individual thread is made up of about 200 microfibers. So that means that this image resides on about 1% of a single thread wherever the image appears. And that depth, that density is uniform throughout the entire cloth. Well, let me tell you, a Maillard reaction would never have that kind of consistency. You're going to have some areas that are blotchy, some areas that are denser, lighter. It's just going to be varied, and we don't see that variation. And it's so naturalistic explanations just don't work. And which is what leads then people to think, well, maybe maybe we're looking at, and after all, if this cloth is the burial shroud of Jesus, then we know that something pretty significant occurred on the third day. Maybe we should explore that. And so then that's what, so that's what gets people thinking about, what some burst of light, burst of radiation. See, now I'm in for light. I do think that is responsible for the image, but at the same time, there's no way to replicate it. We don't know what happened in the tomb exactly. We can't. I think the closest we've come to it is with the work of Paulo Lazzara. He's a physicist in Italy, and his team did a lot of experiments with ultraviolet excimer lasers. These are high power pulse lasers. And they determined that a 40 nanosecond burst, now nanoseconds is really fast, it's a billionth of a second. 40 of them is still really fast. A 40 nanoseconds, a 40 nanosecond burst on a UV laser against a control sample of linen achieves the same depth and coloration as we see on the shroud. And I'm saying, now that's cool, is because the best explanation for what happened to Jesus in the tomb comes from the Apostle Paul, who writes in 1 Corinthians 15 and 15 verse 52. And here he's not even talking about the resurrection of Jesus. He's talking about the resurrection of individual believers at the end of the age. And listen to what he says. He says, "Behold, I show you a mystery. We will not all sleep." That means to remain dead. "But we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye. For that which is corruptible must put on incorruptible." And he says at the last trump, the dead in Christ will rise, and we will all be changed. Now, Paul's talking about a instantaneous transformational event at the end of the age. Hasn't even happened yet, but this is exactly what happened to Jesus in the tomb. Now, how do I know that? Because Jesus is called the first fruits of the resurrection. If he's the first fruit, then that means we as believers are the rest of the fruit that comes later at the end of the age. And so if you're wondering what happened to Jesus in the tomb, that's what happened to Jesus in the tomb. Now, the question is that reflected on the Shroud of Turin? And I think you could make a case for it. Can you prove it? Probably not. But I think it certainly is suggestive of it. But like I said, the Shroud remains the world's greatest unsolved mystery. And at the end of the day, I think as far as faith is concerned, because that's what the Shroud is all about, I think it was left for the doubting Thomases of the world. When it comes to matters of faith, I think the Shroud brings a person, if they look at it objectively, can kind of, that old expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Well, I think the Shroud takes you right up to the water's edge, but it can never be a replacement for faith. To leap from the fact that this cloth could indeed be the actual burial shroud that wrapped Jesus, you have to go from there to believing in Jesus himself, and that this Jesus did indeed die and in our place and rise again from the dead and defeated the power of death, and that's what it's all about. And therefore making a way for all of us. He said, "He is the way. Follow him." And so that's why I've been doing the Shroud for 45 years. Is to basically use the Shroud as a way to kind of I think what Pope John Paul II said about the Shroud. He called it a mirror of the gospel. It's a beautiful term, the mirror of the gospel. It certainly is. And you know what? That's true whether the Shroud is authentic or not.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's not just what it is; it's what it means. Is even the official position of the church. Of it's not, they're not saying it is authentic or not, but like you said, it is a relic, a piece worth venerating and reflecting on. One thing, it just kind of just from additional correlation, and we get into the faith aspect as well. I don't know if you've looked into this or spoken on this, but for those who aren't Catholic and may not be aware, we as Catholics believe that the Eucharist, that the bread and wine truly and literally become the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And a number of times throughout history, the bread and the wine literally transform into what appears to be visible blood or actual human tissue. And a number of these samples have been, well, first of all, they're examined by the church just to make sure that there's no foul play or mistaken identity. They have been allowed to be scientifically studied. And what seems fascinating to me in association with the shroud is that in addition to sometimes literally being shown to be heart tissue in distress, but the blood, which is almost always associated, is blood type AB. And from what I understand, the blood tested on the shroud is also blood type AB. How much are you familiar with these Eucharistic miracles and the association between the two?
Oh, very. I mean, I've studied. Yeah, I mean, there's the fact that the blood test, AB is important, and it is the same as the shroud, and it's the same as the sudarium. But again, it's without being able to do DNA testing, that would be really terrific if we could do that. Now, they did do DNA on the shroud in 1995. They found a blood particle from the back of the head. This was retrieved from the cloth in 1988 when it was laid out to be to cut the sample for carbon dating. And so this blood sample was later carbon dated in 1995. I'm not carbon dated. It was analyzed for DNA, and it was very degraded. But they did determine that it was human male. So, but that's about it. And which is significant, though, in the fact that paint paint's not gonna, because it's not gonna give you a DNA molecule for so. But again, I guess from the standpoint, it is very degraded, and I'm not sure that we could really. And after that, the church shut down any possibility of doing any further DNA tests. What was done in 1995 was not authorized by the church, so they got all freaked out about it that someone was going to try to clone Jesus. So it is officially, we're not allowed to do any DNA testing, and and I can understand. Also, it's problematic in the fact that technically anyone who's ever touched the shroud, their DNA is on the shroud. So the question is that where would you take your sample from that you knew was from the man on the cloth and not from someone else. And so DNA would be definitive, but again, it's problematic at the same time.
Certainly. Are you aware if there have been any studies done or just incorporated with AI, or if any are planned? And if so, how helpful or useful do you see? Or is there something that you've thought about that you think, hey, this would be very insightful if AI was used to analyze a certain aspect of the shroud?
Well, I imagine there's all kinds of things that are going to be considered for AI kind of investigation. Of course, AI is kind of built on existing data that's out there in the wherever the data is stored. I mean, it kind of is able to sift through it and go through it all, and so it certainly can reveal things or to or to bring things back up that have been forgotten about for, for 50 years. Oh, I forgot about that. It's so, I mean, AI is going to be useful from that standpoint. It circulated on the web last year was the what Jesus looked like based on AI. I mean, based on the Shroud. Analyzing the Shroud, AI kind of did a kind of a human rendering. It was very compelling. It was, so, and was, kind of suggested that, this appears to be the image of a real human being who died from these wounds.
Yeah, I did see those images, the still image, and they kind of turn into short snapshot videos. Just fascinating. Again, to your point, whether or not it's how accurate it is, I suppose we can't necessarily know, but it's neat to see how technology can at least be put to a positive use. What I was going to ask, and someone wanted to know, well, they want to know if you've seen the Shroud, and I read somewhere that you've seen it a number of times, and I'd be curious to know, was that just in a public showing and public setting, or did you have the opportunity to view the Shroud in a more private or kind of research-based setting?
I wouldn't say research-based. We were given, and I've seen it 3 times in the 1988. When did I see it? I saw it in 98. There we go. 98, 2000, and 2015. And in I believe it was in 98, we were given a kind of a private viewing of the Shroud, and it was very, very moving. But we still couldn't get closer than 20 feet, so it's not like we were hands on with it or anything. But it was very moving. The Shroud is interesting because it's as someone who has studied it for all these years, you have to kind of force yourself into a devotional mood, if you will, because the first time I saw it, I had my analytical hat on, and it's like, yep, there are the burns, there are the patches, there's the water stains, there's the so you're kind of observing everything, and it wasn't particularly worshipful, if you will, because I was being too analytical about it. And and so then I kind of had to sit in the back for a while and start to contemplate and just allow myself to get into that, that attitude of veneration. And it was, but it was interesting. I tell people if they want to go somewhere to have their breath taken away, go to St. Peter's. Now that's impressive.
Absolutely. I still have to get there. So, but boy, I'd love to be able to see the Shroud, but I know they only allow that, veneration every so often. And I'm sure it's very hard to.
Right. And they may not anymore either. There's been some suggestion that the authorities in Turin are concerned about its continued deterioration because of exposure to light. See, it's kept dark right now in a sealed case with a argon gas and steady state humidity and everything. They've applied a lot of technology to the preservation of it, and so I think it's very possible we've had our last exhibition of the Shroud, and it's because it was supposed to happen this year, but as you know, it's owned by the current living Pope as of 1983, but with Pope Francis had an exhibition in 2015. They thought it was going to be one in 25, but obviously we have a new Pope Leo. It belongs to him now, and so the question is, what will he decide to do with it? And so no one really knows at this point.
Yeah, I'm guessing being pretty new to the role, he's got a few things to figure out. So could be a little while before we hear about that one.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
You mentioned your book, Shroud Encounter. What can you tell us about your book? Is it Is it comprehensive?
Oh yes, this is absolutely the best book ever written on the Shroud. I'm just kidding, of course, but it is a good book. I spent 5 years working on it, and it is comprehensive, but it's only about 260 pages, so it's not some huge volume that'll take you a year to digest. And it's very very readable. It's got about 75 images in it, and the price point's pretty good. You can buy it on Amazon. I think it's like $18 and some change. And you can also go to shroudencounter.com and you can buy it off my website, in which case you can look through the Shroud store and pick up a few other items to go along with the book. Can't do that on Amazon. But yeah, it's the book's doing well. It's got a bunch of reviews, most of them 5 stars. And I'm still trying to find out who those people were that gave me 4 stars. Who are those people? I'm just kidding. No, it's been very well received, and so yeah, I did encourage people to even a chapter on how Adolf Hitler was trying to find the Shroud.
Wow, I was not aware of that, but I'm definitely going to plan on picking up the book myself. In addition to your book, where can listeners find and follow your latest real-time content and analysis on the Shroud, such as a blog or you mentioned shroudencounter.com?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, go to shroudencounter.com. It's my website. Facebook is Shroud Encounter. Instagram and there's a bunch on YouTube under Shroud Encounter. So there is a lot out there. I don't have a formal blog or podcast or anything, but there is quite a bit out there.
Okay, excellent. And you already kind of answered this a little bit, but is there anything you'd want to expand upon in terms of to our listeners? What would you most want them to take away from the Shroud as a matter of personal reflection?
Well, I would say this. I go around the country and I do these Shroud encounters all over the place. And it's a 90-minute presentation, everything on the big screen, 200 images, and we're going to walk through what the Shroud is, where it's been, its long history, all the science related to it, all the controversy related to carbon dating. And then we're going to get into the identification of the man. Could it be Jesus? Then we're going to look at what is the cause of the image? Could it be the resurrection? And then lastly, we get to the message of the Shroud, which in my opinion is all wrapped up in doubting Thomas. That's why I think it exists, for the doubting Thomases of the world. But the way that I wrap up every Shroud encounter is to understand the purpose of the Shroud. Nothing exists, nothing happens by accident. There is a reason why the linen cloth was left in the tomb. But I'm gonna tell you what the Shroud really is. Let me back up a minute and just say when Peter and John ran to the tomb, first, Mary goes to the tomb first, sees that the stone is rolled aside from the entrance. She peeks in, sees that the body's gone, runs to find the apostles, and says, and I quote, "Someone has taken our Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they put him." So she thinks the body's been stolen. Peter and John run back down to the tomb. This is in John's gospel. And John gets there first, but he waits for Peter, who finally gets there. He goes inside the tomb, sees the linen cloth lying there. Then John goes in. He also sees the linen cloth lying there and believes. Believes what? Well, believes that he had risen. Well, this is significant, is because John then becomes the first of the apostles to believe in the resurrection, and that belief is based on the evidence of the linen cloth lying there. And so it begs the question of what did he see? Now, the Gospels are strangely silent on this. There's a reason for it, because I don't think there could be any mention of the Shroud after Resurrection Day, because if there was any mention of where it was or who had it, it would set off a search and destroy mission to find it. And so the Gospels had to be silent on the whereabouts or even the existence of the shroud. But there is an interesting something. Once we get past Constantine, it's safe to be a Christian now. And so from the early 6th century, there is liturgy that is brought to Spain by a group of Arab Catholics. It's known as the Mozarabic Rite of Holy Week. And they translate John chapter 20, verse 5 and 6 this way. They say, Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. I'm saying, well, wow, now that's interesting. That's not in our translation of Scripture, but that's how they chose to translate John chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. Why would they choose to translate it that way unless it was based on something that they had seen or heard? And so I think that's a really compelling piece of data that suggests that the shroud was known and was clearly in existence in the early centuries. But I want to get to this. This is how I close out every shroud encounter, is that there are 4 words that are commonly used to describe what the shroud is. It's called a relic, it's called an artifact, it's called a mystery, and it's called a symbol. And those words are all fine, but they really don't tell you very much. So I got to thinking, there has to be another idea, another concept. So I searched the Scriptures for all the words that describe what Jesus accomplished for us on the cross. And there are 4 of them. And the first word is bought. We have been bought, we've been purchased, we've been redeemed, we've been ransomed. All of those words, all 4 of those words, are words of transaction. In other words, a transaction has occurred, a payment has been made on our behalf. So I got to thinking, when you go to a store and you purchase anything, what does the cashier always give you? A receipt. And what is a receipt? It's a record of the transaction. It's a proof of purchase. What's on the receipt? The price you paid. So when Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the linen cloth lying there, what did they see? They saw the receipt. They saw the proof of purchase. When they opened it up, what did they see? They saw the price that was paid. They saw evidence of the crown of thorns, or scourging all over the body, wound in the side, nails in the wrists and the feet. Everything that was paid to purchase our salvation is on the receipt, making it an itemized receipt, documenting everything that was paid. Now, it's interesting. So when I close it out and I say, so what does it mean? It means that we have been purchased, we belong to Christ, and we have a receipt stamped in blood that says paid in full. Now, do you realize that the last word that Jesus uttered from the cross is a word in Aramaic, and that word is tetelestai, and it's usually translated as it is finished, but it can also be translated as paid in full, same exact word. So in my opinion, if you ask me what the shroud is, to say that it's a relic is an understatement. It's a receipt. And when you say that it's a receipt, it brings you back to a theological concept that we have been bought, purchased, redeemed, and ransomed. That's what the shroud is.
It's fascinating. It's not a unique way to look at it. It's downright profound. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's definitely something to ponder, just continue to learn more about it. And yeah, really anyone who hasn't delved too far into it, I mean, we're just scratching the surface. But Russ, as you put it, I mean, ultimately it comes down to that. So it's very, very fascinating, and look forward just to continuing to learn more, whether or not we get a chance to talk here in the show. I want to eventually enable listeners to submit questions, and maybe through email or some other correspondence, allow you to continue to interact with guests. But ultimately, thank you so much for being a guest today. And not only appreciate you being here today, but appreciate how much of your time and efforts you've afforded to this project. While I want listeners to be able to learn more and decide for themselves what all this means, the shroud is something that has meant a lot to me personally since I was a young child, and has always caused me to look deeper into my faith. As a matter of fact, what happened, but more so as I get older, what does it mean? I'm sure not alone when I say that. So again, thank you so much for your time here today, and look forward to hopefully, keeping some open-ended correspondence just to allow you to stay connected with our listeners here.
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity. And in my book, I talk about the shroud as a receipt. There's a chapter in there on it, and you can I have these little receipts that I hand out at the end of every presentation. You can pick those up off my website, shroudencounter.com. I sell them in packs of 25. So thanks for the opportunity, and it's always good to proclaim the gospel through the shroud.